In this video, I'd like to take you on a trip back 20 years. The date is the 23rd of December 2003. Up until this particular day, I'd been playing the victim in my own life. Not for the 5 years I thought, but it had been for 12. It's the day before Christmas Eve, and me and my James are working on a trailer. I'd recently bought it to add to the fairground equipment that I already had. It had been a horse box, and I'd bought it to convert it into a game stall. We rubbed all the body down, cut 2 openings into one side so that we could open it up and have shutters through which we could open the stall. Inside, we panelled it out, adding electricity points and painted it up. And I made a sign-written sign that I attached to the roof of the trailer. And it was on that very day that, whilst rubbing down the front of this trailer, wondering what I was doing outside in the snowy cold, that a glaring realisation came to me. I was sanding down the fiberglass, my hands were freezing, and I'm swearing to myself, what in hell's name am I doing out here? I must be mad. My life shouldn't be like this. It wouldn't be if it wasn't for that bastard. It was at that moment that I realised. Back in 1990, I had a business putting amusement arcade machines and video games into pubs, clubs and shops from Weymouth in Dorset along the coast as far as Paignton in Devon. My son Henry had been born in the December of 1990, and due to the actions of one person, with me being more engrossed with my son rather than keeping an eye on things, my business collapsed within the period of a month. What happened shall remain private, but I will say that I blamed what happened to one particular person, one who I trusted my life with. It wasn't until I returned to work a month later that it dawned on me what had gone on in the interim and the problems it caused. The upshot was that we lost everything. I could have gone bankrupt, but after speaking with my dad, I made the decision to sell everything I needed to in order to avoid it. And that's what I did. Over the next year, to keep the food coming in, I started market trading. And the stock I sold? My beloved record collection was my starting stock. It's just as well it was large. Over the next year, it kept money coming in, but we ended up in the position where, by February of 1992, we were just about to be made homeless. I won't give you the details of the next few years as they were painful, and I don't really want to go over them in detail. What I will say is this. Over the next years, we as a family worked and started to get back on our feet. And when I say we, that's exactly what I mean. By 2003, we had a business attending fetes, shows and fairs with fairground equipment that we'd started to acquire over the previous 2 or 3 years. By 2003, my sons James and Henry were 17 and 13, and they'd been fully involved in helping us get our business open and continue in the project, as was my wife Carol. But on that day, with me berating myself about our plight being caused by this one person, I realised for the first time that my ranting and raving wasn't hurting him. I realised that for all the bitterness I harboured, it had absolutely no effect on him at all. I remember thinking to myself that during all this time when I was eating myself up with anger, and the nights I was awake running and rerunning the events through my mind, that he was oblivious to it all and probably slept quite comfortably and most likely never gave his actions a second thought. I realised that day that whilst he may well have been the cause of the problem, that was all that he was. His actions may have caused the events that brought us into the position we'd found ourselves, but after that, everything that happened from that moment was down to me. And even though I worked every hour I could to dig us out of the hole, and now we were starting to get back into a more comfortable position again, deep down in my heart, I was still playing the victim. I realised that my woe is me attitude had been holding us back all these years. Everything I'd done, every thought I'd had, although aimed at rebuilding our lives, had actually been hindering every step of the way because of my victim mentality. I don't think there was a day during those years when I hadn't sworn or blamed this other individual for the situation I was in. My anger was deep down. My stomach seemed to be continually knotted. Sleep was something I rarely had. At night, if I dreamed, it always revolved around our situation. I couldn't see that inch by inch we were clawing our way back. All I could see was that we'd had to go to car boot sales to buy my kids presents for their birthdays and Christmases during those first few years. I couldn't forget that for 18 months my wife and I had pretty much survived on beans on toast in order for us to be able to feed the boys properly. All the time I was doing this, it was eating away at my soul and my self-esteem. And I couldn't get it out of my head that even on the day that my dad died in 1994, I didn't have enough money to put petrol in my car to get from Weymouth to Farnborough, 100 miles away, and that I'd had to go and borrow money from my next door neighbour to get petrol to go. And so all this anger and hatred inside me was affecting me day after day. But at that moment, when I had this sparkling discovery, everything, and I mean everything, changed. At that moment, I realised that the biggest problem I had wasn't all that had gone before, but my attitude towards it. What had happened had happened. But from that moment, everything I did was down to me. How I thought about it was down to me. The realisation that I was hurting nobody other than myself was like a thunderbolt hitting me. I then spent the next 20 minutes or so berating myself for being such a fool. Once again, I was beating myself up. And then, with the snow falling and my freezing cold hands holding the drill, I made probably the most important decision I'd ever made. I looked down at the snow-covered ground, dragged a foot along and made a line, and decided that this side of the line was the past. That's where my anger, hatred and pain was. And the other side of the line was the future. I stepped over it, looked down and decided I was never going back over it anymore. And from that day on, I stopped being angry. I stopped thinking about him and what he'd done and started to move forward. And over the next few years, my stupor lifted, my business improved, and for the first time since 1990, I started to feel good about myself. I started to see what I'd been through over those previous years in a different light. From feeling bad about what had happened to us, I started to see how from virtually nothing, we'd started again and got into the position where we'd rebuilt. I started to feel proud of the things I'd done to move on. I started to see the accomplishments of the past few years. It was the start of me moving on in my business, in my life, and most importantly, in my heart. Don't get me wrong, this isn't a fairy story. Not everything went right. I didn't become a millionaire or even close. But what I did become was proud of who I'd become. Proud of the challenges I'd overcome. The ones that at the time I didn't see as successes, just failures. But as I often say these days, your strength comes from learning from your failures. I haven't come through it all unscathed. Those days of buying my kids presents from car boot sales have never left me. I still feel that as much as I did back then. Christmas never comes without me remembering those years. Sadly, I've never been able to shake off those memories. However, looking back, I know that we did what was needed and we always used to try and make them happy times for the boys. And as I look back to that day, I think of it as my flick of the switch moment. It was the day I got my self-respect back. The day I kicked my stinking thinking out. The day I realised that my attitude, good or bad, was down to me. It was the day I finally got it. The day I realised that whatever happened in my life, good or bad, my attitude was down to me and no one else. I spent years blaming someone for everything bad that had happened after that. And finally, I'd learned the lesson that my attitude controlled how I reacted. And I was the only person who could control my attitude. Don't get me wrong, I'm not perfect. There are still days when my attitude is bad, but I realise quickly and set about changing it. But when I look back, The day before Christmas Eve 2003 was the day my life turned around. It was the day I grew up and became a man. And if you click up there, I'll tell you what optimism can do for you.